Welcome everyone to a special crossover edition of the Kansas Reflector podcast and the Kansas Reflector weekly video update. My name is Clay Wirestone. I'm the Reflector's opinion editor.
I am Editor-in-Chief Sherman Smith.
And welcome one and all. Well, we're here today to talk about election season, and we're reaching a really big date today, June 1st. Sherman, tell us what June 1st means.
Well, this is the filing deadline for any candidate who wants to participate in this election season and get their name on the August 4th primary ballot.
And it is also the deadline for folks who are previously registered as a Democrat or Republican. If you want to change your party affiliation, today's the day.
Today's the day, but there's a little bit of a hang-up over the weekend. The state's voter registration platform, online platform, went down, and so people were unable to make this change online. The Secretary of State's office was instructing people to print off a paper registration form, fill it out, and take it down to their local election office by noon Monday if they wanted to change their party affiliation for the August primary.
Now, let's start, Sherman, by just going over some of the election season stories that have been percolating here for the past few days. I think probably one of the biggest, and it had a lot of other implications, was the filing on Friday of Kansas Secretary of State Scott Schwab to run for governor.
Yeah, we've known, of course, about a lot of people who've been running for governor for a long time, but Scott Schwab is the first, or at least the most prominent Republican to officially file, and he chose a state representative named Ken Rajesh, a Republican from out in Agra, rural part of kind of western Kansas. And what's significant about this is that Ken Rajesh was planning to run for Secretary of State. This kind of clears the runway now for Pat Proctor, a Republican from Leavenworth who chaired the House Elections Committee. He may not be the only Republican on the ballot, but he's certainly the most prominent now that Rajesh is going to run with Schwab.
Well, and we have at Kansas Reflector written quite a few stories about Pat Proctor. It's easy to say, at a minimum, that he is not soft-spoken about his beliefs or stances.
Yeah, I think he's dialed up the rhetoric over the past couple of years as he anticipated this run, and that's gotten him, we'll say, a lot of attention. And of course, for Scott Schwab, this is interesting because polling, I think, has consistently showed that he's pretty far down the list among the 5 most prominent Republicans who plan to run for governor. But there's some speculation as to whether Scott Schwab would decide to stay as Secretary of State or just drop out altogether. But of course, he's choosing to see it through and continue his election for governor.
The other thing that's happening here, Sherman, is we're talking, of course, about people signing, making the deadline to sign up to run for governor. But everyone also has to sign up if they're going to be if they're going to run for the state legislature.
That's right. It's the deadline for any race. So, State Board of Education, some others as well, congressional races, state legislators. One of the things we're keeping an eye on here ahead of the Monday deadline is how many uncontested races are there going to be? I know Democrats have made it a push this year to actually try to put somebody on the ballot in every district or as many districts as possible. But in a lot of years, by the time you get to November, half the races or more are already decided.
And, this is something that, Sherman has written about, I've written about, I've kept track of some social media chatter on this, and I think it's safe to say that at least right now, a large number of races are still uncontested. But we'll see we'll see what today brings.
One that will be contested, of course, is up in Leavenworth for Pat Proctor's seat that he's leaving. We thought it was interesting. Former state Senator Jeff Pittman is running now for the House. He had been in the House before, then moved to the Senate, lost his re-election for the Senate in 2024. He is now filed to get back into that race. There's a Republican on the ballot as well. One of the interesting things about Pittman, a lot of people were upset about the situation with Core Civic in Leavenworth. His wife Holly Pittman was Leavenworth mayor and on the city council, city commission, I should say. She voted to grant the special use permit to Core Civic to reopen their facility as an ICE detention center, and she argued that the city would have faced serious legal consequences. You can't just deny operation to a business because you don't like them. She felt like they did everything they could to set ground rules in this permit to force Core Civic to, be a better operator for this prison. And that was the decision for a vote. But I think a lot of people, especially a lot of Democrats, were unhappy about that. Interesting that this is happening as Jeff Pittman is trying to get back into politics.
Well, there's a lot of this kind of conversation going on around Kansas, not just when it comes to like ICE detention centers, but we've also seen a lot of debate and discussion around data centers for AI use. I don't know that we've seen like something get quite the traction that some of those the ICE centers did in terms of public notice, but I bet you anything that if data centers aren't a factor in some race already, they will be by the time we get to November.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a number of data centers, as you say, that are being considered now in communities all across Kansas.
So going back again to this last week, another big story was one that, let's put it this way. The candidate made a lot of noise about it, but then there were some questions that followed in its wake. And we're talking here about State Senator Patrick Schmidt.
Yeah, a lot of questions about this. Patrick Schmidt, state senator, Democrat from Topeka, he held a news conference in the State House last week where he accused Adam Hamilton of mishandling a report of child sex abuse at the church that Adam Hamilton runs, at a church retreat, I should say, over 20 years ago. A lot of the claims that Senator Patrick Schmidt made, we couldn't verify through the court documents. But here's what we know. There's an incident in 2005 at a church retreat. This is the Church of Resurrection that Adam Hamilton leads. It was a retreat in Lynn County, I believe. In 2005, a couple of boys complained that somebody came into their room at night and touched them inappropriately. Looking at the court documents, testimony that happened in a later case, it looks like, maybe the boys thought they knew who it was, but there was a church investigation that concluded that the boys could not identify who actually came in and did this to them. And so a year later, the same person who was a volunteer, a guy named Scott Preston Moore, came back to the same retreat, was accused of doing this again. This time, the boys there could identify him, and the church took immediate action to, encourage them to go to police. They reported information to police. Scott Preston Moore was banned, I think, from church activities, and the church adopted some policies around screening volunteers and how they handle these kind of things. Some years later, the same individual was implicated in a couple of other incidents, eventually was prosecuted. The two boys from the 2005 incident testified at that trial. That led to him being convicted. He ended up dying a couple of years after that. So what Patrick Schmidt was saying is that Adam Hamilton didn't do enough in 2005 to protect these boys or respond to that situation. Of course, Adam Hamilton's campaign strongly disagrees with that, says Patrick Schmidt is just using the pain of these kids to further his own political standing. We'll say, though, that this kind of backfired on Patrick Schmidt from there was just kind of a robust pushback, especially among Democrats, saying, why are you doing this? This complaint is unfounded. This is dirty politics. You should be above this.
Well, and it's very important to understand kind of the shape of the race here, which is there are a large number of Democrats running in the primary for that U.S. Senate seat. There are at least 7, 8, 9, 50 at this point, and there was a real challenge at one point, for them to try to differentiate themselves from one another. And then, relatively recently, Adam Hamilton enters the race. Shortly thereafter, announces that he's raised $1 million. And he's characterized this way in the story we ran, which I understand that some folks weren't happy about, but he was characterized as the front runner. And I think you can certainly make make an argument that he's certainly a front runner, if not the front runner.
Well, we call him the front runner because he is the front runner. I mean, he has more money, more name recognition, a large following. He's the one guy that the Republican incumbent Roger Marshall seems to be concerned about.
Well, but the point is, when you have somebody that has the name recognition, the network, the fundraising apparatus that Hamilton seems to have at this stage, that makes him a real overwhelming figure on the Democratic side of the equation now. Like he's a big deal, and presumably a favorite to win. And so you look at that, and then you look at what Patrick Schmidt did in terms of the press conference, and also just in terms of the way this issue is framed, right? Because talking about, potential child sexual abuse in the context of a church, that's something that no doubt raises red flags for a lot of people, but it is so, it's a really you're pushing the red button. And there's no coming back from when you push that red button.
Well, it would be one thing if Patrick Schmidt had said, we've had an opportunity to review these documents, we're making them available to the public, but we think they raise serious questions and we think Adam Hamilton owes the public an explanation. That's not what Patrick Schmidt did. He came out hot with a bunch of allegations that I'm not going to repeat here, that were a little over the top. And I think that's why we saw the pushback. I should note also, by the way, that during that news conference, our reporter Anna Kaminsky, and you should read her 2 stories about this, by the way, because she goes into great detail of what we actually know happened in these situations. During the news conference, she asked Patrick Schmidt about this mysterious website that had popped up that was attacking Adam Hamilton with these same accusations, with all of these documents. And Patrick Schmidt said, we have nothing to do with that. That website was then taken down shortly after the news conference, and a new one popped up. What we saw on that one, of course, was all the documents that were on it had in the metadata, the name of Patrick Schmidt's campaign manager. And so when we pressed them for an explanation, of course, the campaign manager admitted, yes, I built this website and I put all the documents on there just for the public to see. They deny still having any involvement with the first one, but this raises more questions about whether they may have violated campaign finance law because they didn't disclose that this was part of a campaign. There was no paid for by disclosure on that website. That was just sort of like, not as serious of a problem perhaps as making wild accusations that caused a lot of people to criticize Patrick Schmidt, but it was just sort of another thing that made people go, why are you doing this?
Yeah, and as I was just saying, it's a situation where people are going to have really strong reactions, and if people have such strong reactions about something, then you've got to have the goods to back it up, right? Because or otherwise it looks like you're really out there all on your own, which it feels like Patrick Schmidt was a little bit after the events of this last week.
You started to talk about the number of candidates in this race. As of this recording, 10 candidates have filed for the Democratic nomination. So far, Patrick Schmidt had not filed as of this recording. He would be the 11th Democrat in this race. It's really interesting. We're seeing this across all of the congressional races. It's unusual that we are seeing so many Democrats filing for these. A lot of times Democrats, there's one person running unopposed in the primary. This year, I think all of the Republicans, I think, have a opposition, even Roger Marshall, the Republican U.S. Senator. All of the Democrats in all the congressional races have challenges, sometimes 3 or 4, in this case 11 people running for the nomination. Even Sharice Davids, the one Democrat in Congress, has a primary challenge. I think that's a little unusual. And I'm not sure why this is exactly, but it's different this year.
Well, putting my opinion editor / analysis hat on, my suggestion would be, I think that you have Democrats who are very fired up this year based on President Trump's continued decline in popularity because of other issues like the cost of living and so forth. I think Democrats are highly motivated to get out, but I think we're also dealing with a situation where for whatever reason, and I would suggest personally, I would rather see more of these folks perhaps deciding to run in, state legislative races where there are uncontested seats rather than continuing to go in these, file for, various DC-based races. But of course, you understand why people are going for the DC-based races, because that's where so much of the news coverage that people consume is from. So much coverage comes out of DC, and everything is about what your Congress people are doing, what the president is doing, and so people want to have a voice in that.
Yeah, I think there's plenty to complain about in terms of what's happening in the State House these days, but certainly what we're seeing at the national level out of this administration in DC is unparalleled, I think, in at least recent history.
Well, and as I've said, I just think, especially, before the 2024 elections, I wrote a little bit about this Kansas Women for Harris group. It was on Facebook, and they had kind of this huge membership. I've continued to watch this group. They've changed their name now. I believe it's like Be the Bear or something along those lines these days. But there is a real organized, progressive / democratic activity in Kansas. People really want to, people in these groups really want to see things done. To me, it's very reminiscent of, if you recall, like the enthusiasm and energy kind of behind the Tea Party movement back in, the early late aughts and early 2010s against President Obama. And it was very common on the left at that point to say that was all fake. But people really were very charged up at that point. And I think, we're 15, 20 years on, and people are really charged up again.
Well, and if we're looking for, an example of one of the things that has people fired up, we got a glimpse this week of just, the real fallout from one part of the Big Beautiful Bill, the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill Act. This was the understanding of how many people have been stripped of food assistance.
That's right. So this was highlighted. This was information highlighted by Kansas Appleseed. I believe it's actually the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities that had released these estimates. Their estimates were towards the end of last year that 21,000 Kansans had lost their SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, is what it's called, used to be food stamps. 21,000 Kansans lost their food assistance, and of those 21,000 Kansans, 10,000 of them were children. And it's important to understand that this is not necessarily that the requirements of, for SNAP changed, as in you needed to make even less money or something. The way that the Big Beautiful Bill works is that more kind of reporting requirements were put in place. The requirement that people, reapply more often, verify their income more often. In other words, just adding layers of bureaucracy and challenge for people to get these kinds of benefits.
Yeah, this is very intentional. If you don't want to have to fill out 40 or 50 pages of paperwork every week, eventually you'll get tired of this or make a mistake or forget to, whatever the circumstances, and then you're dropped off.
And this was also something that was understood when the Big Beautiful Bill was being debated and passed. This is part of why, this is part of how the bill, it added spending in terms of tax cuts and various changes that the president wanted, but then it cut spending in other ways. And this was a way that it counted spending as being cut. There was the understanding that adding these verification requirements would make it more challenging for people to enroll and people would drop off. It was, in other words, it was absolutely intentional, and it was forecast.
I was going to say, in terms of bringing this back to election season, we also understood that this was on the agenda prior to the November 2024 election. And you wrote a column about this, making the argument again that, as we know, elections have consequences. 700,000 Kansans who are registered to vote did not participate in that election.
Yeah, we have about 2 million registered. I mean, as of the 2024 election, in November, we had a slightly more than 2 million registered voters in Kansas. And if you look ultimately, and I mean, I was just looking at the presidential race, but I think we can, kind of extend that out, that it's more or less accurate. About 1.2, 1.3 million people cast ballots for the presidential race, which means you've got more than 700,000 people who just didn't show up.
And, conceivably that could make a difference in one of these congressional races where we had, one Democrat voting against the Big Beautiful Bill Act and 3 Republicans voting for it in the House, 2 Republicans voting for it in the Senate.
And of course, too, even just on the local level, there are things that state governments can do to offset impacts like that from the Big Beautiful Bill at the state level, or to just say to everyone, suck it up, you've got to deal with it.
Kansas facing a budget shortfall, we'll say, within the next couple of years can make it very difficult.
So looking ahead, Sherman, or when I say looking ahead, not looking very far.
Within hours.
Within hours here today on Monday. So let's talk a little bit now as we're wrapping up. What is happening today at the Secretary of State's office?
Yeah, there'll be the rush that we often see in the final day to file, where candidates are coming in, making sure they get their name on the ballot. We'll see things like, I would assume we've seen this in the past, an incumbent who has already filed will pull their name off the ballot at the last second. Basically, they were holding the spot so that nobody would dare challenge them, and then they get to put their appointed successor in behind them when they file at the last second. And, we'll have reporters over there tracking all this, talking to people about who they are and why they're running. The other thing that we'll see today is a lot of the big names who are running for office have not actually filed yet. That includes, on the Republican side, Ty Masterson, Vicki Schmidt, Jeff Collier, and Phil Sarnecki, the 4 most prominent Republicans who are running for governor. I think Vicki Schmidt has announced who her running mate will be. The other 3 have not.
Well, and there are going to be, almost without a doubt, surprises.
Yes.
Let's put it that way.
Expect the unexpected.
Because, it is possible that one of the candidates that we've mentioned at the last minute will decide not to run. It is possible that you will have new candidates. We obviously have the 2 front runners for the Democratic nomination for governor in State Senators Ethan Corson and Cindy Holscher. Could there be more Democrats? Maybe.
Yeah, we could get a surprise last second filing if somebody shows up. And
could we get extra candidates for the Senate race, the U.S. House races? I mean, all of these things are possible. And I think you can very confidently say that there were a lot of phone calls going back and forth over this weekend.
Yeah, I think that's true.
So, just stay tuned to Kansas Reflector, to our website and our newsletter and our social media channels to learn all about that. If you want to keep track of all the stories and opinion columns that we run every day, sign up for our newsletter at kansasreflector.com/subscribe. That's kansasreflector.com/subscribe.
Of course, the newsletter is completely free. All of the stories are completely free to read. We don't have advertising on our website. And don't worry if you're not eager about election news. We have a lot of other coverage planned as well.
And also, I will say, we frequently get email messages from folks who say, I have to stop. I don't have, we have regular contributions from some folks. We really appreciate it. If anyone wants to donate to us and send us some support, that's always appreciated. But sometimes people write and say, I can't send you a monthly donation anymore. I'm afraid I'm going to have to not take the newsletter anymore. We don't care. You can keep getting the newsletter. It's fine. We will continue to send it to you if you would like.
Yes.
Well, with that being said, Sherman, that seems great.
It is always a pleasure to talk to you about politics, Clay.